I come to ask you to help to win this fight. If we win it, this hardest of all fights, then, to be sure, in the future it is going to be made easier for women all over the world to win their fight when their time comes.
Hello and welcome back to Not Small Men. This episode looks at the most important people in the game, the players. Being a female footballer is of course not one experience. Players you talk to have a wide variation of experiences and of course pay and facilities too. When it comes to supporting players, what's best practice? What's worst practice? And when world-leading expert and researcher on female physiology and nutrition Stacey Sims tells us women are not small men, what exactly is she referring to and what differences can understanding this make to the women's game and those who run it and coach it? Where to begin? I think first off it makes sense to look at how girls can currently start off a career in football in England. What is the pathway into the game? The FA have worked hard to create a clear and open route in. Sue Campbell explains how it works.
It starts now with Discover My Talent, which is a local community programme where we're working with community trusts, and we're looking for talent that won't find us. We're looking for those local community schemes, probably not affiliated to the FA, just happening, and they are referring. So we've had over 3,000 referrals from those schemes. And all of those youngsters have now been tracked and looked at, and we've got a hardship fund, so that allows us to give youngsters which is sponsored money, transport or whatever's needed to get them to the local DTC. The ETCs are now, we've got a network of them that are within an hour of most kids' travel. So most of the RTCs were great, but there were 35 of them across the whole of England, and there's 75 of them, I think, now. What we now got at the FA, we have a club strategy where we, if you only are running boys section, you get 1 star. If you're running a boys and girls, you get 2. Boys, girls, and disability, you get 3. So if you're providing opportunities, and each of those comes with a different level of investment. So we're driving this change, and by 2028, we hope to have 1,000 clubs who are offering age range, opportunities for girls to compete at every level. So we're not just, the women's game is no longer sort of in a box on its own. We've now affected all of the main strategies of the FA, so that any strategy that's emerging has got women and disability locks into it, so that we can really be football for all, which is what we say we are, and that is really important. So you've got Discover My Talent, ETCs, and then we've got PGAs, professional game academies. And the professional game academies are linked to the Super League and Championship clubs. So think of those as you're finishing school. And that's all we're investing in. Doesn't mean that's all that's happening. It's all the FA can afford to invest in. I don't know if you know the average cost of a men's boys academy in a Premier League or even an EFL club, but it's fairly considerable. It's in the millions. I have a total budget of 3 million to pay for my entire talent pathway for the women.
Of course, before this official pathway begins, what happens in schools is also crucial in terms of resources, but also appropriate coaching that recognises that girls are not small boys. In fact, in earlier school years, it's the girls who are developing the fastest. Evie Casagrande is a high-performance coach who has worked with clubs and national associations across the world, as well as FIFA and UEFA. She explains more about differences in childhood development.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is as girls, we go through growth maturation way earlier than boys. So when boys go through their peak height velocity, that's what we call it, whereas the rapid phases of growth around 13 years old, you see girls reaching that way earlier, 10, 11 years of age. And when we look at kind of research and where girls and boys kind of chronologically age in terms of exposure to strength and the movement literacy, which is getting them through different movement patterns, and you see kids, they're 10-year-olds, they're supposedly should be playing a lot of different sports and not early specializing in one. And then you have that, which you see kids at that age already losing the passion of the sport because they're early specializing. When you go through your peak high velocity, there's a lot of different changes that happen in your body. And I think boys will get faster and stronger, but girls get increased fat body mass. So there's a little bit of difference in the psychological adaptations to that phase, because as boys will get faster and stronger, girls will probably get a little bit heavier. If you don't have a system around an ecosystem that nurtures not physical but also the psychological aspect, you lose a lot of girls in the sport because of that, and that's a big problem.
In its previous 4-year strategy, Inspiring Positive Change, the FA in England set itself a target of 75% of schools offering girls equal access to football. It hit the target a year early, in 2023, and has since set a new goal of 90% for the next 4 years. And some 20,000 schools are now part of the 320 Barclays Girls Football Schools partnerships, representing 90% of eligible schools in the country. This is really positive news for the future of the game and shouldn't be taken for granted. The latest 4-year strategy document includes as one of its 4 priorities to deliver equal opportunities for women and girls to play. Outside England, there are countless countries where very little progress has been made in this area. I asked Roland Giscard d'Estaing from the Woman Up Agency in France what opportunities there were for young girls in his country.
Hardly any effort made into, girls at school, zero. Literally, there's no opportunity for girls to play football at school, and close to zero. Unless, until 13 years old, they can play with the boys. If a young age girl wants to play football, she has to go to club. I've met countless young women saying, I can't play football at school, so where should I play?
Of course, money, or lack of it, is often part of the problem. Despite all the good work, Sue Campbell knows how much more could be done with sufficient backing.
Some's from the FA, and some has come from the Premier League. They have given us a grant to help us. It could do with at least multiplied by 10 plus. The PGAs, the clubs invest in those. We give them an amount of money. I couldn't even tell you what it is off the top of my head. But the reality is, a lot of the clubs, Super League Championship clubs, are struggling to maintain a senior squad, let alone run a professional game academy for youngsters. So, and what you don't want is a poor PGA. You want a high quality experience for those young players. There's a lot to do on the talent pathway. That's going to be one of the next huge shifts in the game. We've got to find much better investment from somewhere. You can imagine I work on that pretty well every day. I'm a bore on it. But we're trying to find more resource for that.
And this is one of the biggest reasons for the revenues that the women's game is earning, particularly through TV deals and central sponsorship, to be distributed much further down the pyramid, because that's where so much of the early player development happens. This kind of sharing of resources does not come naturally to football. At least that is the version run by men's clubs. But when you do have fair resourcing further back down the chain in schools and colleges, it works for the whole game. In the US, colleges are a key stage in identifying and developing players, and the talent they develop is then well prepared to join NWSL or USL Super League clubs. Here's Jenny Haskell at Deloitte Sports Business Group.
Those channels of the university system helping to be a funnel towards the professional leagues, but also the university system and how it starts recruiting, really set up the competitiveness of the academy systems. The academy systems and kind of the youth development systems helped for our national teams, but also for kind of funneling into however many hundreds of colleges across the United States that then can be competitive at every level.
There is a reason why the US women's national team has been so successful for the last 30 years. It's called Title IX. This was a federal law introduced in 1972 which made gender-based discrimination for federally funded education programs illegal. It single-handedly forced the creation of college soccer teams across the United States. everywhere else to this day outside the US, and that includes the UK, a school, college, university or any institution can allocate the money it receives from the state to boys' sport over and above girls if it chooses to. Many mistook the UK government's announcement in 2023 of more money for girls' football in schools as some kind of new and mandatory help, but it was a continuation of general sports funding, stating that schools should allocate fairly by sex, but not actually enforcing it in law. This is why many voices are now calling for a UK Title IX that would mandate any institution receiving government funding directly or via an agency to allocate it equally. And it wouldn't just be schools and colleges affected. It would include the FA, the Football Foundation and Sport England too, who all receive government funds. But what of the current player journey and experience? Once a player gets signed to a club, for most, they certainly haven't hit the big time financially. Star players in the WSL in England are reported to be earning between £200,000 to £400,000 per year, plus international team earnings, but they are not the norm. Figures are hard to come by, but reports by The Telegraph and BBC over the last couple of years suggest that many players are still only earning around the £20,000 a year mark. Outside of the WSL, there's even more opaqueness. Licence agreements between the WPLL, who now run the professional game in England, and clubs require minimum hourly rates and hours per week that offer some baseline protection, but in the national leagues many players also have day jobs or part-time work to supplement their income. Alexander von Schirmeister is UK Managing Director of Zero, who are big sponsors of women's football, and they work with millions of small businesses.
Many of the clubs we talk to, and many of the even many of the players, right, even some of the lionesses, they all have their own side business, right? As we know, unfortunately, football oftentimes isn't enough as a single source of revenue for anyone playing football as a woman. And so many of the football players that we know and that we watch on TV have side businesses. And guess what? We oftentimes then help them on making sure that those side businesses work as well as possible with the Zero software. So we have many, many, many stories.
And increasingly, players are putting their voices behind campaigns for change in football and wider society. Irene MERINO, Global Head of Gender Balance at sporting goods retail giant DECATHLON, thinks that this also offers an opportunity for players to supplement their salaries.
For example, in terms of sponsoring, when I look at the top women in football, it's true that, of course, it's very important that a brand promote and support you as a player. The truth is that women, they have even as I said, a societal role. Today, they are playing football and also they are creating some debates about what's happening with equality, what's happening with pay equity, what's happening with our possibilities as professional players in terms of having a good nutrition plan, having the good trainers, so behind all of that, I think that sponsors and clubs should understand that it's not only about give them a brand to support them, it's also about give them the ecosystem to be 100% professional.
Meanwhile, the reality for most pro and semi-pro footballers is stark. Here's ELLIE LEEK, who played at Le Havre, Charlton, Lewes, Blackburn and finally Stoke City, retiring from the game last season.
I think it's so important. There's female footballers that, unless you're like one of the best in the world playing for a huge national team that are one of the best teams in the world, no female footballer right now is making enough money to where after they finish playing, they, can just do bits and bobs here and there. Like they need to, have a plan. And yeah, I think for the sustainability of women's football, having a dual pathway is the best way to go about it.
Many clubs simply don't have the budget to offer a full-time wage for full-time training and playing. Beyond the WSL, lots of players are holding down jobs outside football to support themselves. So when clubs move to daytime training 3 or 4 times a week, but with only modest budgets, players with well-paid outside careers are asked to make an impossible choice. Ellie's experience is not unusual.
They wanted to go daytime training. Bear in mind, I worked a full-time job, like 9 to 5. I was fully remote, so it was really like flexible and good for football. But they wanted to go to daytime training 3 times a week. And I was like, you want me to leave my full-time job where I'm making great money and like I can't do my job at other hours. Like I need like my core working hours.
The money offered was nowhere near what Ellie's daytime job paid. At some clubs, this gap is bridged by additional jobs for players within the club, where other budgets are available, either in office functions or in coaching.
A lot of like what Lewis have done as well is like where like Rianne had like a job with the club, or they set up like rookie kickers and things like that, where you're actually giving women the opportunity to have like a job as well as play football, so that one, they're not stressed about money, but two, like they have a job that's flexible enough that can work around football. So yeah, it's hard because it's great that teams want to go full time and be like in the daytime training at normal hours, but if you're not going to pay a full-time wage for people to be missing those core working hours, it's just not sustainable. And I think the UK, like as a whole, are just missing out on so many talented footballers because they just can't do it, and it's just not fair on them. So they're just like, oh, I've had enough of it. And like that's exactly my case. Like I was like, it's too far, too much work. It's just not worth it. It's impossible. You live in life in impossible circumstances.
But what caused Ellie to give up playing wasn't ultimately the money, it was her personal safety.
I'll be honest with you, the reason I'm not playing anymore is because I was petrified of getting hurt. I got an injury in America. I hyperextended my knee, got a bone, like really bad bone bruise. They thought I think I'd sprained my MCL, ACL, tore my meniscus, was seen by a surgeon the next day, had a scan. Like everything was done like within 24, 48 hours. I knew what had happened. I knew like my plan of recovery, like everything was done straight away.
Footballers know they risk potential injury every time they play. But in England, without the reassurance of adequate medical support, players face the possibility of a bad injury jeopardising not just their football prospects, but possibly a well-paid work career outside the game too. Here's Ellie again.
I knew if I got hurt, like I was screwed. Like I was done. Like my career was over. Like I didn't know if I'd run again, that sort of thing. There's just nowhere near the support, even the level of physio. Like I get that the physios in women's sport, like they qualified, like, but they're like fresh out of uni, like they don't have the actual hands-on experience. Or, you know, in America, you'd see like a specialist, like I see an orthopedic surgeon for my knee, you know. After every game, we're in an ice bath, which are inside like full-blown like metal ice baths that are constantly at one temperature, and then there's a warm tub, and then, you know, it's completely different. We'd go in something called like a bod pod, which would like tell you everything about your body, like your fat, your muscle composition, if there's like a weakness, and then like your gym program would be designed towards that. And then your S&C coach was like a doctor in like physical strength, and yeah, you just had everything. And then you had like nutritionists working with you to, oh, this is what you need to be in. Like we had a wellness kitchen where if you was trying to like gain weight, it would tell you what to eat. If you needed to maintain, like if you need more protein, like everything was just put out for you. Like it was unbelievable. And like in the UK, yeah.
At this key development stage of women's football, funding is still modest for most clubs. So when the league licence under which a club operates contains a long list of mandatory expenditures, it is these that have to be prioritised. And that can be at the expense of things which will help the welfare of the players.
I understood there was like rules and regulations for clubs to maintain, like, but I didn't realise the level that it was, and like how, yeah, again, like I think the people that are affected the most are the players by it, because they chose, oh, if you want to play football at this level, you have to play in impossible circumstances, or you have to be poor for years, or you need to move your entire family up here so that you can live off, you know, your parents. Like, and I think the FA, and it's great, and I think they're like, if you're not going to invest properly, like, you're not going to be in, they basically want to filter out the clubs that don't have money to suffice full-time football. But like, again, for the sustainability of football, women's football, for the sustainability of the players and their well-being, moving it like that, it's just going to impact. I can guarantee more women football players trying to play at championship level, but not being like able to like afford it, have just fell out of love with the game. So like they essentially, I think, going to end up losing more talent, and like the game would be affected, because if it was, you know, accessible to everybody, and created in more like a sustainable way, then the game itself would arguably be better, just because there'd be better players involved.
Coaches and practitioners notice this stuff too. Here's Evie Casagrande again, who has seen inside clubs at all levels.
And I think England, what I've been exposed to England in terms of resources, I worked with Brighton, and they have amazing facility with amazing resources and investment. Things are getting better and better, but there are the other side of there's a huge disparity in terms of teams, right? There's teams that have everything, and then there's teams that have no resource or no coaching resources available. So I think that until we get to a point that the investment comes, and it's coming, we're seeing still a huge disparity.
This takes us to player training and welfare. In so many ways, coaching women is not the same as coaching men. This is specialist work, and it's still early days on the necessary research into the physiology of female footballers. In this next section, we're going to hear extensively from Evie again, and also from Dr. Stacey Sims, who more than anyone else has worked to push the understanding of what it means and what it requires to be a top female athlete. Top of Evie's wish list is far better coach education.
Because it doesn't matter if I'm a player and I have the app and I know my cycle, but then if my team and my staff doesn't have that understanding, then coach education is where we need to go, because you don't need to have all the technology in the world and all the money in the world to actually build a player-centered system where all the are connected. Probably when you talk about player recruitment and the need for coaches and recruiters and scouts to understand that there is a phase where there is this rapid growth, that if they're patient and they know how to work around it, give them the right nutrition, give them the right support mentally, physically, they could get even stronger once that phase is, and if they have that strength development prior to, and this is the biggest point here, a lot of girls, because the chronological age that normally girls and boys enter strength development is about 13. You look at those girls losing that prior to PHV strength development, because if they go through that phase around 11 and they're starting strength at 13, they're losing that big window of developing better movement, better foundation, understanding, education.
One area where there has been growing research that is starting to create new practices in clubs is the menstrual cycle. Evie talked to me at length when I asked her about the importance of educating players, coaches and, to be honest, men too, particularly to the point that the discussion of periods should be an upfront part of women's football.
The biggest thing, I think, and it comes down to education mostly, and player knowing their bodies better and the effect of the different hormones and the circulating hormones into the different phases of the menstrual cycle. And when we talk about menstrual cycle, we're not talking about just the bleeding phase, right? We're talking about the entire cycle: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. So, phase 1, phase 2 before ovulation, phase 3, phase 4 after the ovulation. So within that cycle, there's undulating hormones going, progesterone, estrogen, luteinizing hormones, a bunch of different hormones that would affect how a player feels. The matter of fact is, I think the biggest thing is, a lot of the times we see this as a weakness. It's like, oh, it's just on the menstrual cycle, we need to change things, because the fact of it is very, very individual, and that's why it's so important to educate the player to know, to monitor where they are in their cycle, to identify trends. The menstrual cycle, for me, the biggest thing is educating, monitoring to understand trends and the individual and how to communicate within a staff to make that experience for that player a little bit better, and for them to understand what goes around in their bodies that affects the physical and mental performance.
Dr. Stacey Sims is one of the world's leading figures on female athlete health. She's an expert on female physiology and nutrition and is very clear about how making training regimes responsive to footballers' menstrual cycles is a crucial aspect of injury prevention.
When we're looking at some of the new data that's coming out and the globalization of research in women's sport, regardless of socioeconomic status, we're seeing different training loads have an impact on soft tissue. And when we're looking at how are we mitigating the training load to actually become adaptive instead of stressful, then we're reducing injury. So when we're talking about the menstrual cycle predisposition, if women are tracking their cycle and understand how they feel, and we look and say, okay, well, we're doing really high intensity, hard work on the days that you feel fantastic. And then we're just going to dial it back a little bit. If someone came to you and said, hey, you know what? I was out for a run and I tweaked my hamstring. I don't feel that great today. I don't want to do anything that's going to cause a hamstring injury. As a coach, you would modify the training program accordingly so that someone wouldn't tweak their hamstring. So if a woman has that open conversation and comes to you and says, you know what, today I feel really flat. I don't think I should be doing this high intensity, or I don't feel like I can do the high intensity. As a coach, you're like, okay, so we're going to dial it back today. We're not going to do lots of sprint work and high intensity work. You fit in and you're modifying based on what your body needs, but we're still cohesively playing as a team. So this, I think, is a miscommunication that isn't really being identified, where we're looking at the menstrual cycle and the way a woman is tracking and how she's feeling as a way of injury prevention with regard to the stress resilience.
ACL, anterior cruciate ligament. It's a small band of dense connective tissue that runs diagonally in the middle of the knee. It prevents the tibia, the shin bone, from sliding out in front of the femur, the thigh bone, and provides rotational stability to the knee. It's the injury that many footballers fear the most. Recovery takes anything up to a year. Female footballers are around 6 times more likely to get this injury than their male colleagues. So, is the dreaded ACL injury down to changes during menstruation, or is there more to it than that?
From a physiological mechanism, there is more laxity in the tendons and ligaments around ovulation, but there's also a reaction from the muscle and the joint capsule to counter that laxity. So when we start looking at training loads and we start looking at how women are recovering and what the training load and the stress resilience is, we can start to talk that it's the decrease in the stress resilience that is causing more of the soft tissue tendencies for injury. Because when we're looking prospectively, people are like, oh yeah, it was around my menstrual cycle, or oh yeah, it was around ovulation. But there isn't a definitive blood marker or urine marker that says, yes, definitively that was at your LH.
EV2 is clear that good practice can cut the instances of ACL injuries.
We talk about this constraint model. So the constraint model is pretty much like, for example, I get my players to play a 4v4 indoor with a heavier ball. You can still be playing football, but you're exposing them to different constraints. So they develop different skills. So like I grew up playing futsal, which is a 4v4 indoor, right? And Brazilians, the fact that Brazilians are so skilled sometimes is because of that. We all grew up playing futsal, which is a very fast game. It's a different type of ball. You have to teach yourself to hold yourself very well. You need to think fast, very fast. You need to be very quick with the ball. And you don't have that time that you have in an 11v11 game to think about things, right? And decision-making in football, it's a huge component of the game. Be able to see things around you fast enough. And that's from an injury prevention perspective. It's actually very important to be able to develop this cognitive skills of dual tasking, doing 2 things at like kind of the same time. So being able to, when the ball is coming to you, see the movement of the other players. When you're about to receive a ball, work around your peripheral vision to see who is coming so you can prepare your body and get your body in a better position to get hit or something like this, right? So when we talk about injury prevention, that's why I think as a strength coach, I get quite frustrated when all the research is all about the women have higher incidence because of the way their hips are, the way their physiology are, which is very important. But the psychosocial, the cognitive side, how do you train that? It's as important.
In many sports, some female athletes see the absence of periods as a good thing, as one big thing it will be better to not even have to worry about. But Stacey has a health warning for those who believe that.
There is that myth that if we are amenorrheic, then we're training well and we're hitting it and we're able to be really robust and perform well. And that comes from the myth of when women first got into sport, that they couldn't show any fallibility, because the idea of being successful in sport was all about being powerful, aggressive, pushing forward, and having any kind of undercurrent of not being male. So if a menstrual cycle or menses or a period came into play, that was a definite indication that they weren't part of being male. So it became this whole thing that if you lose your period, then we don't have to worry about it, and you're more like us, so you're more acceptable in the sport. So we're trying to change that narrative and really try to focus, look, as a female, in order to make sure that you are healthy, we really want to see regular menstrual cycles. Because when we look and see what it means to be amenorrheic or for your periods to stop, that means your body is under a high stress load and in a breakdown state where it can't support general health, let alone training adaptations. So we like to say, if you are naturally cycling and you have a regular menstrual cycle, then we see that your body is robust enough to take on daily life stress as well as training stress, adapt to both to get you fitter and keep you healthy. When we start to see amenorrhea, that means that there's a complete misstep and your endocrine system is completely downturned. So when your endocrine system is down and you don't have estrogen and you don't have any ovulation, every system takes a hit, including bones, metabolism, cognition, proprioception, ability to sleep well, ability to withstand daily life stress.
For female players, eating the right things and the right amounts is vital, says Stacey. It's all about fueling properly.
By and large, women don't eat enough carbohydrates. And by and large, most recreational to sub-elite athletes don't eat enough, full stop. So we just really have to encourage the idea that in order to adapt well and perform well, we need fuel. So we're not talking calories in, calories out. We're talking about fuel for the high performance body. And high performance could be anywhere from skills practice as a kid all the way up to a World Cup game. So we really have to put that eye of, we need fuel to be able to train, because that's where the stress comes from. And we need fuel to recover from the training, because that's where the adaptation comes from. We really need to fuel for every session. Because if we are fueling before and after, then we are telling the hypothalamus that, yes, there is nutrition available. So we don't have to look at conserving and downturning the thyroid or having an impact on our endocrine system. So we just keep talking about, we need to fuel, we need to fuel. On an individual basis, if people or girls or women are still having more soft tissue injury, or they're feeling more bloated and having inflammatory things that are going on, then we start to dial it in and say, okay, well, maybe we need to add some glutamine, or maybe we need to look at more anti-inflammatory foods in your diet. So it becomes a whole perspective rather than breaking it up into low hormone versus high hormone. But by and large, we know women need to eat more carbohydrate. Even if they're like, carbs are scary, your body needs more carbohydrate. Women's bodies run better on carbohydrate. They need more carbohydrate, and they should be eating more carbohydrate. We have clinical, we have health, and we have performance. And people will look at clinical data, pull it over to the health expo, general pop information, which then gets pulled into high performance, because we see this, rhetoric of paying more attention to social media than the experts. And so people are looking to their peers, social media, other places, rather than talking to the dietitian or a nutrition specialist that can say, you know what, as an elite footballer, you probably should not be following a low carb or a ketogenic diet or doing intermittent fasting, because we need to fuel.
Women don't even age like men, according to Stacey Sims.
As we're going through, we're seeing that men age in a linear fashion. So their training kind of ages with them. their metabolism changes according to this linear fashion. But for women, there's so many other issues that come up with regards to menstrual cycle health. Maybe we're going on an oral contraceptive pill, or maybe we're going on an IUD. That changes hormone profile. And we don't have enough research to show how that actually impacts training and training considerations. We do have some research that shows that the progestin component of those hormone contraceptions can affect how fast muscle fibers are firing. So that can affect power and speed. Then we have things like pregnancy or infertility that becomes an issue with regards to energy availability and how robust the endocrine system is. Then we get into perimenopause, then we get into postmenopause, and all these different hormone profiles can affect the epigenetic responses of muscle, bone, mood, brain, cognition, reaction, proprioception, all of the things that go into being successful in sport.
And then there's the mental aspect, the need to give space to any footballer to develop themselves as an all-round person.
Coaches are still not letting players build autonomy, because all we do, and it happened the same with me as a coach in my first years of coaching. You just tell players what to do. And you're like, I want you to do this. I want you to, as a strength coach, I want you to get to run this distance in this amount of time. And then as I kind of mature into, like, the more I learn with mentors and kind of the experiential learning that I go through, it's like, wait a minute, how about we set the environment for players to figure out their bodies and like listen to their bodies and listen to what they need to do. I've learned this in school, like the self-determination theory, the 3 things that help with motivation, right? And autonomy is the biggest one. Autonomy, competence, and relateness. Those 3 things as part of my coaching. I always try to do those because I know the motivation for the player is so important. So our coaches allowing players to have autonomy, to figure out things on their own, to throw scenarios, technical scenarios. This might happen. What are you going to do? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to play there on the pitch.
With so much more to contend with than their male counterparts, female players also need space.
Our job as coaches is to really help them to be good at to have the best environment for them to be at their best, but also there's a whole world out there, and there's you have to build an identity outside of sports, and also be able to have the time and space to self-reflect. And I think self-reflection is a big thing that a lot of players don't develop, but it's no fault on their own. I think the system doesn't help with that. And it's the same thing as if you work so many hours a day, have 100 meetings in a day, you don't have the time and space to actually develop yourself as a person and as a practitioner, right? So I think the system is kind of doing the same, because all these are growing pains of the development of the game, because it's growing rapidly. So people are putting more and more and more. But if we strip back and kind of go, okay, let's give those players some mental space to also get that self-reflection and self-awareness. So then, because that is so important as a player, and I see it now.
There are so many ways in which female players can be supported to help them thrive, but just not enough money around. And what there is mostly just at the top of the game.
Let's just take a simple issue like physical conditioning or doctors or physios. You know, not that long ago, even your biggest clubs were taking someone from the men's game and sort of lending them across the fence once a week or something. That's not what we want. Women are different. I know this is very hard for people to conceptually understand, but their bodies are different, their minds are different. Things like menstrual cycle, pelvic floors, all the problem we've had with ACLs, all of those things. If you look at any injury in men's football, you will find a million blooming references on it. If you look in women's, you'll find 3 or 2 or none at all. So there's huge volume of research and understanding of the women's game. And the danger is, because the men's game is perceived to be so successful, the view is, oh, well, we can send the men's fitness guy and it's only just add a bit of water and you'll be okay. No, it's not. And one of the things I had to do when I came into the FA was make myself incredibly unpopular in St George's Park by keep saying, I don't want the fourth best person in the women's game. I want somebody who knows the women's game. And they'd look at me and go, well, we don't employ those. Well, blooming well employ those people. Because I don't want I don't want people who are not familiar with elite women. We've now got that. And we've got a great coach. And blowing me, we're successful. It's kind of like, come on, does this all make some sense here? And again, in the clubs, some of the clubs have got people who are very familiar with elite women. An awful lot of them don't. And so we set our license requirements to a high standard in order to get the right people around the player. Because you asked the question, who's the game built for? The players. Who do we care about? The players. What do we want to look after? Their welfare and health and development. So you've got to have a physical condition, but you've got a good sports psychologist, etc., etc. You can't do it on pennies. It costs money. So that broadcast distribution, yes, of course, we desperately want that money to go further down the pyramid, but right now we're having to use it to improve the professional environment for our players.
Players in the WSL are enjoying greatly improved training, physio and welfare provision, but that still leaves a lot of players in the national leagues and even in the championship asking, when is it their turn? Or as a minimum, what's the plan to support them too? Here's Helen Ward, now General Manager at Watford Women, but with a glittering playing career at Arsenal, Chelsea, Reading and Watford before retiring in 2023.
People saying the game's in a great place. I kind of had two hats on when I look at that, because I look at it from a perspective of I've been involved in it since 2003, 4 maybe even, at Watford. So if I look at it from where it was then to where it is now, oh my God, what a brilliant game it is now. But where I think of, like you said, the comparisons I think that are being made, we're looking at the very top part of the game, where it is coming on a lot and there is a lot of support and there's a lot of backing and commercial and sponsorships. It doesn't take too long to go down a little bit for that to completely change, where there's not enough of the things I've just mentioned. So I sort of split my career into segments of, way back when it wasn't even a thing. It was just a hobby for everyone. I didn't know of any players, bar probably someone like Rachel Yankee. Even then, that was probably not until 3-4 years into my playing career that I knew of any players, of any sort of stature.
I asked Helen if she wishes she was back at the start of her career for what's happening now.
And actually, I really don't, because I do feel like I see it from, there's a generation of us who have got to see it all, from being a hobby and paying to play to then being professional, and to see that growth. I wouldn't change that for the world. I've had a great time in my career. I've not had the pressures of trying to win a contract every summer and competing to do so, and the politics and the agents and all the stuff that now comes with football, some of which is great, some of which I don't think is great. But I had a fantastic time, and who's to say that if I was starting my career 10, 15 years later, I'd have enjoyed the successes that I was lucky enough to enjoy. I might not have been good enough. I might not have had the mentality to deal with that professional side of it. Coming into the game at 15, 16, I was just enjoying it with my friends. And then that happened to take me into the top division. Then it took me to Arsenal and Chelsea and places like that, but probably at the right stage of my life where I was able to cope with those sorts of demands and pressures, which again were nothing compared to what they are now. So yeah, to sort of sum it up, I think the changes from then to now are massive and can't be understated, but it doesn't mean that the job's done.
And Ellie Leek says there are several things she isn't missing since retiring, like social media stalkers.
I'd say most of the negative comments have probably come from men's accounts. Saying that, a lot of the accounts that do go off are very there's not a person behind it, if that makes sense. They don't identify as anything on Twitter. It's just a picture of the Man United badge or, I don't know, a cartoon character, So, yeah, obviously they're hiding behind things.
Worse still, Ellie explains how issues like personal relationships within clubs can cause an almost impossible working environment.
If anyone had any issue at all, there was nobody to speak to. There was no safe space because of how manipulative and how unsafe and how much of a struggle it can feel to just be in women's football. And when you're not protected, the men's club essentially completely just let it down, like, because of how bad the situations that you're put in, the way you're treated, like, emotionally, like, it's not okay.
There is a players' union in England, the PFA, which protects professional male and female footballers. But membership for women is only open to the 12 teams in the WSL and players who previously played in that league. Just 12 clubs covered, versus 92 in the men's leagues. In 2021, a group of over 100 players from the Championship and National Leagues wrote to the PFA to ask for representation beyond the WSL. But for the PFA, this is not straightforward. They are set up to represent professional players, and who is or isn't professional is designated by those who run the leagues. Player representation doesn't just require the revenue from membership fees, it also requires the cooperation of clubs in the negotiation of working condition frameworks. But as with everything, it's a matter of willing and of money. Player welfare is too important to leave on the back burner. In fact, it's hard to imagine what matter that the leagues or clubs could be working on that is a greater priority than the very safety of the players themselves. As we come towards the end of this episode, I wanted to look at a really key question that is not often asked, maybe because it's never asked of male footballers, and that is, why? Why do you play football? For men, if they choose, there aren't really any barriers to playing, even to trying to make a career of it, if you're good enough. But there is a why for female players, because in a sport designed by and for and dominated by men, in the context of a society that works that way too, the very idea of a woman or a girl wanting to play football has for a long time required the breaking of a norm. I found it really inspiring and also very grounding to ask the why question about girls in some of the most patriarchal societies. Let's hear from ANJALI SHAH in India, Kelly Lindsay, who coached the Afghanistan women's national team, and Sadia Sheikh, who founded DR Women's Football Club in Pakistan.
Girls in India are playing because they are standing up against something in their life. It could be early marriage, it could be a lack of education, it could be a lack of freedom, it could be not being allowed to express yourself. Some of the girls who play don't even care about the food that they get because it is more than the food that they get back home. For those girls, they're getting 3 square meals a day and without having to do too much, and that's more than they probably get in their homes. But they just play for the experience, for that 2 months of time away from their families, away from their chaotic lives or whatever that they're dealing with. They just want to run away from all that. And this is an escape. Women in India play football for all the reasons except the sporting benefit. Of course, sporting benefit comes a little later. Once they start playing the game and they start enjoying the game, then they think about their personal growth in the game.
And my first meeting with the team and really asking them, I said, we can't continue forward until we know why we're doing what we're doing. Because it's a really this is not just playing football. This is a really complicated situation we're trying to address and make sure you feel safe and healthy, and football's a good, positive space for you. And their why, and I'll never forget, I remember them standing up and telling me and being like, this is like the biggest purpose I've ever done football for. Their why was, we want to show to all the women and girls of our country that it's safe to walk out of your home. That's why they were playing football. The deeper meaning, safe to walk out of your home, safe to go to school, safe to get an education, safe to have a career, safe to have a job, safe to have a life that you own, and it's your autonomy. And I think globally, in all the places I've worked, this is the key factor, that sport gives women the opportunity to have a career and a life where maybe they wouldn't, because for some reason, it is accepted deep in society that if you're good at sport, then our country can love you.
Waking up in the morning, preparing, helping their mothers, going to school or colleges, sometimes they don't even go. And then coming back, again helping her, doing the homework.
then coming to the academy. Now, when they come to the academy, those 2 hours are there, as I said. So that is the only free time, free express time, I should say, which they can express themselves and they can enjoy themselves. And when they go back, then they help their parents to prepare dinner or finish the homework, sleep, and it's the same routine.
All around the world, just the act of playing football has huge power and meaning for women and girls. The football pitch is a place of freedom, of liberation from societal constraints of how women are supposed to be in public. Football can help break those norms and change women's lives, but even in the more highly developed football markets of Europe and the United States, there are women who still do not feel safe at their place of work. They live in fear of an injury that will lay bare the lack of medical resources at their club, or their work environment is one where they don't feel safe from sexism or even physical and mental harm. And when things do go wrong or feel unsafe for players who are not full-time professionals in England, there's no union to turn to. So whether a player is suffering due to circumstances at her club or perhaps due to other non-football factors, her welfare may depend on the lottery of how good that particular club's welfare systems are. And as we've heard, many lack the financial resources to offer much in the way of support. We hear that one day the women's game will be big enough, there'll be enough money throughout for all clubs to afford the appropriate level of welfare for their players. Surpluses will cascade down through the leagues, like those coin pusher machines in amusement arcades. But I think that women's football shouldn't be a lottery. So many interviewees talked about collaboration, cooperation, sisterhood as a defining quality of the women's game. So, is the game really comfortable with the chasm of welfare and safety that exists between players at the top of the game and, well, everybody else, the majority of players? The PFA don't have the remit or resources to represent all female footballers. It takes money to recruit more staff, to develop resources to bring every club into a collective agreement for their women's team. Indeed, if the PFA are limited by the P in their name, then it's reasonable to look at other existing unions, perhaps like Unison, who are able to cover all female workers regardless of status. The Carney Review of the women's game in 2023 did set out a path for the championship to become fully professional and thereby qualify its players for representation. It also called on the FA to fund player representation, but all this still wouldn't cover players in the non-fully professional league below. And anyway, would only happen at the end of a long process. The seriousness of unrepresented female players at football clubs and patchy welfare points to a more urgent and comprehensive approach that supports all female players. This could involve the licences under which women's teams currently operate having to include the obligation to sign up to unionisation so that every player is covered by an agreement on their working environment, but at the same time that there is a universal league-wide programme of medical and welfare cover for all players, and that the costs of these measures is covered not by the FA, but by a universal welfare levy of all clubs based on parent club turnover, such that there is a transfer of money from the wealthier clubs, not from the modestly resourced FA, down through the pyramid and not to other clubs, but rather directly into a central medical welfare resource for the players. Players protecting other players. An unprecedented safety net that says the most important people in all of this are the players, and in the women's game, players look after each other. It says we can't, in all good conscience, create an amazing new version of football that turns a blind eye to even one player. The money to do this is already there. It's just not in the right place at the moment. And if anyone says, but that's not how it works in football, in men's football, then the obvious answer is, this isn't men's football. Women deserve first and foremost safety, and women will look after women. Women are not small men. Final word goes to former player ELLIE LEEK.
Football's a full-time job, regardless of what level you're playing at. Like, you have to eat right, you have to make sure your recovery is right, you have to sleep right. Your mind has to have the right balance between being stressed and not being stressed, being in your parasympathetic system and your sympathetic system, and to be able to perform at an optimum level. And for most women, if you're not at the top level, or you're not a younger kid coming through with a well-off family who can support you in doing that, reaching that goal, then you're not going to be able to perform to your optimum level. So yeah, football's a full-time job, and if you can't like reach your peak, like there's definitely privileges that other players and other girls have, and yeah, I guess boys do have more of.
In the next episode, I'll be looking at the revenues and costs in women's football, the business reality of the game. See you then.
Not Small Men is a Good Intent Media production.